At 30 minutes past midnight on June 22, 1941, Georgy Zhukov lifted a telephone receiver and reported to Joseph Stalin that German forces were advancing toward the frontier. 3 hours later, at 3:30 in the morning, with the invasion already underway, Zhukov called again. He heard first the thick, sleep-dulled voice of the security officer on duty. Then 3 minutes of silence, the soft crackle of the line, the distant hum of the Kremlin's electrical systems, before Stalin picked up. This nocturnal rhythm was deliberate. Stalin's office in the Kremlin, a high-ceilinged room with heavy curtains drawn against the Moscow night, walls lined with operational maps, dim yellowish lamps casting pools of light across his desk, operated according to its own temporal logic. On June 23rd, alone, according to the Kremlin Appointments Diary, declassified in 1990, Stalin's working day stretched 22 hours and 35 minutes. Over the first week of the war, he held 158 meetings, totaling 88 hours and 40 minutes with 45 named officials. The air grew dense with pipe smoke. Ashtrays overflowed onto side tables. Exhausted generals stood sweating in their full uniforms, radiators pumping heat regardless of season, waiting for the dictator's questions. The late-night summons was an instrument of power in itself. It kept commanders off balance, perpetually on call, unable to build independent authority or develop relationships outside Stalin's direct observation. When the Western Front collapsed that same June, General Dmitry Pavlov was arrested, transported to Moscow, tried, and executed within a month, shot on July 22, 1941. The charge was treason, disguised as negligence. Pavlov was rehabilitated in 1957, the Soviet Supreme Court acknowledging that the accusation was without foundation. But by then, the lesson had been permanently inscribed into the institutional memory of every surviving officer. Competence offered no protection. Indispensability was temporary. Stalin fostered rivalry as deliberately as he fostered fear. He assigned overlapping objectives to his commanders, praised one in front of the other, hinted that either could be replaced at a moment's notice. During the 1945 race to Berlin, he kept the boundary between Zhukov and Konev's fronts deliberately ambiguous, letting each marshal believe the other might claim the prize. Rokossovsky had survived NKVD torture in 1937, only to be released and promoted, a living reminder that today's favorite was yesterday's prisoner. Marshal Tukhachevsky, once considered irreplaceable, had been tried in a single day on June 11, 1937, and executed that same night in an NKVD cellar, a pistol shot to the back of the head. No one forgot. In Stalin's system, the firefighter who saved the state one day could burn the next. Yet Stalin's system demanded more than survival. It demanded proof. In August 1939, Mongolia, Georgy Zhukov would deliver it. The battlefield at Khalkhin Gol offered no mercy and no concealment. Low, rolling hills dotted a landscape of short grass and mineral dust, where every movement kicked up clouds visible for kilometers across the flat terrain. The heat of the Mongolian summer pressed down like a weight. Japanese forces of the 23rd Division held a salient east of the Khalkha River, dug into positions their commanders believed unassailable. Zhukov examined the terrain and saw an anvil waiting for his hammer. He spent July secretly assembling an overwhelming force. 4,000 trucks hauled supplies across 600 kilometers of steppe, their engines grinding through the nights to avoid Japanese aerial observation. He concentrated 498 BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks, their Christie suspensions designed for exactly this kind of terrain, along with 557 aircraft. The buildup was a masterpiece of operational deception, conducted under strict radio silence and camouflage discipline. Private Kenji Yamamoto had been digging for 3 weeks. The trench walls around him were hard-packed earth, the color of dried bone, crumbling at the edges where the summer heat had baked the moisture out of the soil. He had grown accustomed to the taste of grit between his teeth, the way it worked into his rice and water and the corners of his eyes. At night, The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours, and his sweat-soaked uniform turned cold and stiff against his skin. The observation post assigned to his squad sat on a low rise overlooking the Soviet positions across the river. Through field glasses, Yamamoto had watched the enemy lines for days, noting the movement of trucks in the distance, the occasional glint of metal, the dust plumes that rose and dissipated in the afternoon wind. The intelligence reports said the Russians were weak. The intelligence reports said the Mongolian auxiliaries would collapse at the first serious assault. At 5:45 on the morning of August 20th, 1939, the horizon to the west erupted. The Soviet artillery barrage began with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a continuous rolling thunder that built and built until it became a physical pressure against Yamamoto's chest. The shells came in waves, first the heavy howitzers, their detonations throwing columns of earth 60 meters into the air. Then the field guns, faster and sharper, walking across the Japanese forward positions. Then the mortars, filling the gaps with a constant rain of steel fragments. Yamamoto pressed himself into the bottom of the observation trench. The wooden supports above him shuddered with each impact. Dust cascaded down in sheets, filling his nose and throat. He tried to identify individual explosions, to map where the shells were falling, but the sound had merged into a single, continuous roar that made thought impossible. The air turned, orange with suspended particles. He could not see his hands in front of his face. At 6:30, the roar became deafening in a new way. Aircraft engines, dozens, then scores of them, screamed overhead. Yamamoto risked a glance upward through the smoke. Soviet bombers flew in tight formations, their silhouettes black against the dust-choked sky, guided by smoke markers fired from the artillery positions below. The bombs fell in sticks, each detonation sending a shockwave that compressed his lungs. A captured Japanese officer's diary, found later on his body, recorded the impact. The fighter and bomber planes of the enemy, some 50 of them, appeared in the air in groups. At 6:30, the enemy artillery opened massive fire. It is horrible. The observation posts are doing everything possible to spot the enemy artillery, but without any success. The next day, he wrote again, his words compressed by exhaustion. A multitude of Soviet-Mongolian aircraft are bombing our positions. Their artillery is worrying us all the time. After the bombing raids and artillery fire, the enemy infantry charges to attack. The number of the killed is increasing. While the center pinned Japanese forces frontally, Zhukov's mechanized brigades swept wide on both flanks, cavalry doctrine executed with iron horses. The BT tanks, their 45mm guns traversing smoothly on modern stabilizers, punched through positions held by troops equipped with obsolete Type 94 anti-tank rifles that could not penetrate Soviet armor at combat ranges. By August 25th, the pincers closed. By the 31st, the 23rd Division ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Soviet losses were severe: 9,703 killed, 15,251 wounded, 253 tanks destroyed. Zhukov accepted them without hesitation. The calculus was simple. Victory required payment, and he had the currency to spend. Stalin took note of that too. He noted everything. That calculus would be tested sooner than Stalin anticipated. At dawn on June 22, 1941, 3 million German troops crossed the Soviet frontier along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in human history. 153 divisions, 3,350 tanks, 2,770 aircraft. Within hours, the Red Army's forward defenses disintegrated. The Luftwaffe destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the first day, most on the ground, lined up wingtip to wingtip on exposed airfields where peacetime parking arrangements had been maintained, despite intelligence warnings. By June 28th, Panzer Groups 2 and 3 had closed a double envelopment at Minsk, trapping 3 Soviet armies. 320,000 men marched into captivity. The divisions that had defended Bialystok and Minsk simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. Stalin's, purge-hollowed command structure buckled immediately. The officer corps had never recovered from 1937. Experienced commanders were dead or in the camps. Their replacements were terrified of initiative. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Volkov lay in a ditch 12 kilometers west of Minsk, listening to German tanks. The ground vibrated beneath his chest with each passing vehicle. Through a gap in the roadside vegetation, he could see the dust plumes rising, a continuous column of armor moving east, always east. The heat of the June afternoon pressed down like a fever. Mosquitoes clouded around his face, drawn by the sweat and the blood from a shrapnel wound on his forearm that had stopped bleeding but had not stopped hurting. Volkov's regiment had ceased to exist 4 days earlier. He no longer knew where his battalion was, or his company, or even his squad. The last coherent order he had received came on June 24th, fall back to Rally Point Gamma, but Rally Point Gamma had been overrun before he reached it. Since then, he had been moving through the Belarusian forests with whatever soldiers he encountered, a group that grew and shrank as men joined, fell behind, or disappeared into the trees, pursuing their own paths east. The thirst was the worst part. He had emptied his canteen 2 days ago. The streams they crossed were either dried to trickles or fouled with the bodies of horses and men. He had learned to drink from the muddy puddles left by tank tracks, straining the water through his shirt and ignoring the oily film that coated his lips. A German motorcycle scout passed within 20 meters of his position. Volkov pressed his face into the dirt and breathed through his mouth, tasting the mineral tang of Belarusian soil. The scout did not slow. Why would he? The roads belonged to the Wehrmacht now. The Wehrmacht pressed east. On July 27th, the pincers closed again at Smolensk. Another 300,000 prisoners. By August 8th, Army Group South had encircled Uman, 100,000 more. General Kirponos, commanding the southwestern front, would die in September trying to break out of the Kiev pocket. 650,000 men lost in that single encirclement. By the end of summer, the Red Army had suffered more than 6 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. In October, the autumn rains came. Dirt roads west of Moscow dissolved into rivers of mud, the Rasputitsa, the season without roads. Vehicles sank to their axles. Columns stalled for hours in the sucking morass. But the Germans kept coming. On October 10th, with enemy spearheads within 60 miles of the Kremlin, Stalin made a telephone call. Zhukov was summoned from Leningrad. Moscow had to be held. There was no one else left to ask. The train from Leningrad brought Zhukov into a capital preparing for evacuation. Foreign embassies had already fled east to Kuibyshev. Government ministries were burning documents in oil drums outside. The Kremlin walls, the acrid smell of classified paper drifting through the streets, mixing with coal smoke and the first cold of the approaching winter. Factories were being stripped, their machinery loaded onto rail cars heading toward the Urals. In some districts, looting had begun. Stalin received Zhukov in his office late that evening. The conversation was brief. Timoshenko's Western Front had collapsed under the weight of Operation Typhoon. 3 Soviet armies were encircled west of Vyazma. Another pocket was forming at Bryansk. More than 500,000 men were trapped. The road to Moscow lay open. "Can we hold the capital?" Stalin asked. Zhukov requested time to inspect the front before answering. The next morning, he drove west through columns of refugees streaming in the opposite direction. Women carrying bundles, old men pushing carts, children walking with the blank, exhausted faces of those who have walked beyond tiredness. What he found at Western Front headquarters confirmed the reports. Timoshenko had 45 divisions on paper. In reality, most were shattered remnants, some reduced to regimental strength or less. The Mozhaisk defense line was held by cadets, militia battalions, and workers' detachments armed with whatever rifles could be found. Private First Class Anna Petrova had never fired a rifle at a human being. She was 19 years old, a third-year chemistry student at Moscow State University until 3 weeks ago, when the call went out for volunteers to defend the capital. Now she stood in a trench near Volokholamsk, her hands wrapped in rags against the cold, watching the tree line 200 meters to the west. The Mosin Nagant in her hands was older than she was, a 1891 pattern, its stock worn smooth by generations of soldiers. She had fired it exactly 8 times during training. Her marksmanship instructor had been a veteran of the Finnish War who walked with a limp and never smiled. He had told her that the rifle would kick hard, that she should breathe out before squeezing the trigger, that she should aim for the center of mass because headshots were for novels. He had not told her what a German tank would sound like when it was 100 meters away. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. The skin on her fingers had cracked and bled where it touched the metal of the rifle. Her felt boots were already soaked through with snow that had melted and refrozen into a rim of ice around her ankles. The bread ration had been frozen solid for days. She had learned to thaw it against her stomach before eating, the cold mass pressing against her skin until it softened. From the trees came the sound of engines. Zhukov telephoned Stalin from the front. "We'll hold Moscow," he said. There was no enthusiasm in his voice, only calculation. He demanded immediate reinforcements from the Far East and Siberia, every reserve division Stalin could scrape together. Pattern had begun. Crisis had activated the instrument. Now came the test of whether Stalin's firefighter could contain a conflagration that had already consumed armies. Through November, as German spearheads froze into immobility within sight of the Kremlin's towers, Zhukov hoarded his reserves with the discipline of a miser counting coins. Siberian divisions arrived by rail from the Far East, men in quilted jackets and felt boots who understood cold as a weapon, not a hindrance. The ground froze solid in mid-November. Movement became possible again. By December 4th, Zhukov had assembled enough strength. He telephoned Stalin. "We must strike now before the enemy consolidates." At 6 o'clock on the morning of December 6, 1941, Soviet guns opened along a 200-mile front. The Kalinin front had begun the previous day. Now Zhukov's western front joined the assault. Rokossovsky's 16th Army drove forward from Volokholamsk. Govorov's 5th Army pushed from Mozhaisk. The temperature had dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt had not felt his feet in 3 days. He sat in the remains of a peasant house 20 kilometers west of Moscow, his back against a wall of frozen mud and shattered timber. The remnants of his company, 47 men down from 186 on November the 1st, huddled around a fire built from broken furniture and the pages of books they had found in the village. The smoke rose through holes in the collapsed roof, carrying sparks into the gray December sky. Schmidt was 31 years old, a career officer from Saxony. He had crossed the Polish border in September 1939 with confidence in the Wehrmacht's invincibility. He had driven through France in May 1940 with growing certainty that the war would be over by Christmas. He had entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 with the expectation of a campaign measured in weeks. Now he sat in a burned village whose name he had never learned, wearing a summer uniform supplemented with whatever his men had been able to scavenge, felt boots too small for his feet, a woman's shawl wrapped around his head beneath his steel helmet, a horse blanket tied with communication wire around his shoulders. His leather boots had frozen solid around his feet. When he had finally cut them away, 3 of his toes had come off with them, black and dead. The Mauser rifle propped against the wall beside him was useless. The lubricating oil had frozen solid in the bolt mechanism. He had watched his men try to fire their weapons that morning when the Soviet attack began. The firing pins moved through the frozen oil like they were pushing through tar, striking with insufficient force to detonate the primers. The machine guns had failed completely. The sound of Soviet artillery, a continuous rolling thunder from the east, had not stopped in 3 hours. The Russian guns, he had noticed, kept firing. The Russians did not seem to have the same problems with cold. The Wehrmacht began to crack. Solnechno-Gorsk fell on December 12th. Klin 3 days later. German diaries recorded the chaos. Exhausted men stumbling through snow, abandoning equipment, retreating through villages whose names marked the route of their withdrawal. One German officer wrote simply, "We are beaten." The Red Army paid its own price. Soviet casualties during the entire Moscow operation approached 1 million men. German losses numbered perhaps 280,000. The arithmetic was brutal but decisive. By January, the immediate threat to Moscow had evaporated. German forces had been pushed back 60 to 150 miles. It was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat, proof that the German army could be stopped, could be driven back, could bleed. For Stalin, the victory confirmed something specific. When crisis demanded results, regardless of cost, Zhukov delivered. The pattern had been validated. The firefighter had contained the conflagration. Stalin would remember. But Stalin never allowed gratitude to calcify into trust. The same quality that made Zhukov valuable made him dangerous. He assigned competing commanders to parallel operations, then compared results in late-night telephone calls that turned military coordination into gladiatorial performance. Zhukov would receive word that Konev's forces had advanced 12 kilometers. The implication hung unspoken. Why haven't yours? Stalin cultivated these rivalries deliberately, understanding that commanders racing each other would drive operations forward with reckless speed, each terrified of appearing second best. By August 1942, Stalin needed something different. On August 27th, the summons arrived, not to command a front, but to oversee them all. Zhukov arrived at the Kremlin to find Stalin pacing. The maps of Stalingrad spread across the table, showing German forces pressing into the city from the northwest. The 62nd Army was being crushed against the Volga, street by street, building by building. "The situation in Stalingrad is extremely serious," Zhukov reported. "The enemy is pressing hard on the city. If we do not act decisively, we risk losing Stalingrad." Stalin's question came flat. "And what do you propose?" "We must prepare a major counteroffensive against the flanks of the German 6th Army. The enemy's flanks are held by weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces. We must strike there with overwhelming force." The appointment that followed marked a fundamental shift. Not commander of a single front, but deputy supreme commander, Stalin's operational architect with authority to coordinate the Stalingrad front, the Don front, and the southwestern front simultaneously. Over 1 million men, 15,000 artillery pieces, 1,400 tanks. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Sorokin could no longer remember what clean air smelled like. He crouched in the basement of a building that had once been the Red October Steel factory, or perhaps a workers' dormitory, or perhaps a school. The structure had been shelled so many times that its original purpose had been erased along with its walls. Above him, what remained of the upper floors groaned with each artillery impact, raining plaster dust and fragments of brick onto his helmet. The smell in the basement was a physical presence, human waste from the corner where the latrine bucket had overflowed 3 days ago, the iron tang of blood from the wounded men lying against the far wall, the sour reek of unwashed bodies pressed together in a space designed for perhaps 10 people, now holding 40. Over it all hung the chemical bite of cordite and the sweeter, more disturbing odor of gas gangrene from an amputation that had been performed yesterday without anesthesia. September in Stalingrad brought fog in the mornings, thick mist rolling off the Volga that reduced visibility to 5 meters and muffled the sounds of combat into a directionless murmur. By noon, the fog burned off, replaced by smoke from the burning oil storage tanks on the riverbank. The sky above the city had been orange at night for so long that Sorokin had begun to forget what stars looked like. His platoon had crossed the Volga 4 nights ago on a barge loaded with ammunition and reinforcements. The crossing had taken 45 minutes. German artillery had found them halfway across. Of the 200 men who had boarded the barge at the eastern bank, 30 reached the western shore. The fighting in Stalingrad had no front line. The Germans held the third floor of this building. His men held the basement and the shattered remains of the first floor. The stairwell between them had become a no man's land, where grenades tumbled down and bodies accumulated in the darkness. On November 13, 1942, Zhukov and Vasilevsky visited Stalin to present the final Operation Uranus plans. The dictator was in unaccustomed good humor and agreed to everything. The launch date he left to Zhukov's discretion, a delegation of authority that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. Stalin added the word "approved" to the map signed by both commanders. 6 days later, fog rolled across the Don River Valley as temperatures dropped toward freezing. The first snow had fallen on November 9th. By the 19th, visibility was reduced to meters. At dawn, Soviet artillery opened fire on Romanian positions north and south of the German salient. Not the concentrated Wehrmacht forces grinding through Stalingrad's ruins, but the weaker Axis allies holding the flanks. Corporal Ion Dumitru was eating his breakfast when the world ended. He sat in a trench near Kletskaya on the Don River line, spooning cold mamaliga from a tin mess kit. The corn porridge had frozen during the night. He was letting it thaw against his tongue before swallowing, the way his grandmother had taught him when he was a child in the village outside Bucharest. Dumitru was 24 years old, a conscript in the Romanian Third Army. The Romanian divisions held the northern flank of the German salient, a position that extended for over 100 kilometers with few natural defensive features and fewer reserves. Their anti-tank weapons were leftovers from the previous war, inadequate against modern Soviet armor. At dawn, the northern horizon turned white. The Soviet artillery preparation consisted of hundreds of guns firing simultaneously. Dumitru heard the shells coming before he saw their effects, a rising whistle that multiplied and merged into a continuous shriek. Then the world exploded. The first shells landed 200 meters to his left, throwing up columns of frozen earth and snow. The second salvo walked closer. Through the smoke and dirt cascading into the trench, he saw shapes running, his comrades fleeing toward the rear. He tried to stand, found his legs were not responding correctly, looked down and saw that his left boot was filling with blood. A fragment had opened his calf without him feeling it. Behind the barrage came the tanks. T-34s emerged from the fog, their tracks churning through the frozen mud. The Romanian anti-tank guns opened fire. The 47mm shells bounced off the sloped armor. The T-34s did not slow. By nightfall, the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. German staff officers in Paulus's headquarters initially dismissed the reports. By November 22nd, Paulus telegraphed Hitler. The Sixth Army was surrounded. The pincers had met near Khalkhin, sealing 250,000 German troops inside a pocket. Hitler forbade breakout attempts, promising air resupply that would never materialize. Moscow had proven Zhukov could prevent catastrophe. Stalingrad proved he could engineer it. The firefighter had become the architect of encirclement, and Stalin's dependence deepened with every burning German tank on the frozen steppe. The soldiers began calling him Nash Zhukov, our Zhukov, a possessive that carried dangerous weight in a state that permitted only one possessor of victory. Frontline officers' letters and diaries spoke of him with the affection reserved for trusted commanders. Batya, father, the old man who appeared unexpectedly at forward posts, overruled incompetent superiors, and threw divisions at the enemy until the Germans broke. Stalin watched this reputation accumulate with the cold attention he reserved for potential threats. The Supreme Commander ensured that Pravda mentioned Zhukov in operational communiques, always carefully subordinated. Under the leadership of Comrade Stalin, and with the skillful command of Marshal Zhukov, the formula appeared again and again, a grammatical cage. By January 1945, as Soviet armies stood on the Oder River 50 miles from Berlin, there was never any question who would lead the final assault. On April 1, 1945, Stalin summoned both Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev to Moscow. He spread a map across his desk and drew boundary lines for the assault on Berlin. The line stopped at Lubin, 50 miles southeast of the German capital. Zhukov's first Belarusian front received the sector containing Berlin itself, but Stalin made the arrangement conditional. If Zhukov's advance stalled, Konev's first Ukrainian front could sweep north and claim the prize. "Who is going to take Berlin?" Stalin asked Konev. "We or the Allies?" Konev's answer was immediate. "We will take Berlin." The race was set. On April 16, 1945, Zhukov launched his assault on the Silo Heights with 140 searchlights meant to blind German defenders. Instead, the beams reflected from smoke and dust, silhouetting Soviet infantry as they advanced into withering fire. The breakthrough Zhukov expected in hours took 4 days and tens of thousands of casualties. Private Nikolai Fedorov died on the third day, April 18th, in a way that took 4 hours. He was part of the first wave, moving forward through the artificial twilight created by the searchlights that were supposed to be blinding the Germans, but instead were illuminating the advancing Soviet infantry like targets in a shooting gallery. The ground ahead was flooded farmland, frozen in places, ankle-deep in ice water in others. The machine gun burst caught him across the midsection as he crested a low rise. The impact spun him around and dropped him into a shell crater half filled with muddy water. He lay there, staring at the searchlight-bleached sky, trying to understand what had happened to his body. His hands found the wounds, 3 entry holes across his stomach, something warm and wrong leaking between his fingers. The advance continued around him. Men moved past his shell crater, their boots splashing through the same water he was lying in. Some glanced down, none stopped. The attack had its own momentum now, a tide of bodies moving forward, because forward was the only direction that existed. The medics would come later. The medics would come when the shooting stopped. The shooting did not stop. He died sometime around noon when the water level in the crater reached his mouth and he no longer had the strength to lift his head. On April 17th, Stalin telephoned and blurred the boundary line, opening the door for Konev to reach Berlin first. Konev's tank armies reached Berlin's southern outskirts. For 2 days, it appeared Stalin might award him the city. Then on April 29th, new orders arrived. Konev would withdraw from the center. Zhukov would receive the honor of final capture. On May 2nd, at approximately 10:40 in the morning, a radio transmission from Zhukov's headquarters announced, "The Reichstag has been captured, and the Soviet flag is flying over its dome. The battle for Berlin is effectively over." On June 24th, in Red Square, Zhukov rode a white horse across the cobblestones, reviewing columns of troops while captured Nazi. Banners were hurled at the foot of Lenin's tomb. Photographs captured him at the apex. The commander who had saved Moscow, encircled Stalingrad, and conquered Berlin, now elevated to a position that made him Stalin's symbolic equal before the Soviet people and the watching world. It was precisely the visibility that made him unbearable. The machinery of disgrace moved with bureaucratic precision. By mid-June 1946, Zhukov was on a train east, removed from Berlin and reassigned to command the Odessa military district, a provincial backwater for the man who had accepted Germany's surrender. He arrived in Odessa on June 13th to assume a post that was transparently punitive. At a Supreme Military Council session in Moscow, senior leaders recited a litany of charges: Bonapartism, the cultivation of personal glory, insufficient deference to collective leadership. Nikolai Bulganin echoed the themes. Zhukov had exaggerated his own role, allowed excessive praise from subordinates and foreigners, behaved as though victory belonged to him rather than to the party and Stalin. In 1948, investigators descended on Zhukov's Moscow apartments with inventories. Beria's report to Stalin itemized the evidence: 17 gold rings, 3 gemstones, components of 15 golden necklaces, more than 4 kilometers of cloth, 323 pieces of fur, 44 carpets taken from German palaces, 55 paintings, 20 guns. The Marshal who had conquered Berlin was now framed as a common thief, his glory reframed as greed. Zhukov was pushed deeper still to the Ural Military District, 1,700 kilometers east of Moscow. Forced to justify the war trophies, he could only offer, "I shouldn't have collected that useless junk and put it into some warehouse, assuming nobody needs it anymore." He would remain in Sverdlovsk until 1953, watching from the provinces as Stalin's final purges ground toward targets unknown. Other marshals had disappeared for less. Zhukov's survival was measured not in his own strength, but in the dictator's whim. Stalin's death in March 1953 brought Zhukov to Moscow, but not to the mausoleum balcony where the new leadership stood. He attended the funeral as a senior commander among many, not among the circle of power. The smell of incense and embalming chemicals filled the columned hall where Stalin lay in state, the dictator's face yellow and waxen under the lights. Outside, crowds pressed through bitter cold toward the Kremlin, people crushed in stampedes on the approaches. The new collective leadership needed him. In February 1955, he returned to Moscow as Minister of Defense, stepping from a train carriage at Belorusky Station in full-dress uniform, gold hero stars catching winter light on his chest. A brass band played over the hiss of steam and the metallic clank of locomotives. Soldiers presented arms. Behind security cordons, civilians in fur hats and dark coats shouted, "Zhukov! Zhukov!" The firefighter was back. In June 1957, he proved it again, speaking at the Central Committee plenum against Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich's attempt to remove Khrushchev. He accused them of violating collective leadership, of attempting to seize power behind the party's back. His support saved Khrushchev's position. 4 months later, in late October, while Zhukov was abroad in Yugoslavia, the Presidium prepared his removal. The plenum on October 27th condemned him for gross violations of the principles of party leadership, for showing a tendency toward personal rule, for attempting to place himself above the party. Pravda announced his dismissal with bureaucratic precision. His further stay in leadership posts was impossible. The pattern had transcended Stalin. A new leader, rescued by the firefighter, had learned the same lesson about competence. Zhukov spent his final years at a state dacha in Sosnovka, near Moscow. The pine forest around the house smelled of resin and damp earth. He rose early, did physical exercises, walked the paths with a dog. Much of his day was spent writing and revising his memoirs, drafting by hand at a desk covered with notebooks, wartime maps, and stacks of documents. The desk lamp threw a sharp circle of light on the papers in winter afternoons, when it was already dark by 3 o'clock. Visitors came occasionally, former subordinates, old comrades, writers working on war histories. They sat at a round table with thick glasses of tea and metal holders, black bread, and sometimes vodka. Zhukov would tell war stories in a low, even voice, as if reading from a report, one visitor recalled. But his eyes would light up when describing successful operations or comrades he respected. He sometimes walked to the window, looked out at the dark pines, and said that everything he had done had been for the country, not for any leader. On June 18, 1974, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov died in Moscow. He was 77 years old. The Sosnovka dacha became quiet. His marshal's uniform hung in a wardrobe. His medals were locked away. In governments built on singular authority, the most dangerous position is not opposition, but usefulness. Zhukov survived Stalin by years. He survived Khrushchev's gratitude by months. He survived the system he served by understanding that his value was always temporary, his position always conditional, his victories always someone else's to claim. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.